Think about your building and the important equipment or assets it relies on. By putting data to work for you, your building's assets will provide valuable details about their status, how they've been maintained, and their associated costs. When your building's assets perform the way they should, you can expect a more productive environment, less risk from downtime, and improved cost structures. Energy and Asset Performance Services, a smarter approach to facility optimization.
Siemens, ingenuity for life.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the final live installment of the CX Energy virtual experience. These webinars are presented by the AABC Commissioning Group, as well as its sister organizations, the Associated Air Balance Council and the Energy Management Association. I'm Sam Schwartz, and I'm a Member Engagement and Marketing Manager for ACG, AABC, and EMA. Since we were unable to meet in person this year at CX Energy, we're using this platform to bring you as much of the commissioning, energy management, and testing-related education as we can through a combination of live webinars like this one, as well as some additional pre-recorded sessions. Some of you rejoining us may know the drill by now, but allow me to review some instructions regarding the webinar player one last time. We encourage you to submit questions at any time using the Questions tab on the left-hand side of your screen. But while doing so, please make sure to submit questions to the questions box and not the general chat box. A few will be selected to answer at the end of the webinar, and the speakers will answer the rest via email afterward. Also on the left-hand side of your screen, you will see the Resources tab, where you can download a PDF of today's slides. There's also a Notes tab on the right-hand side of your screen, where you can make notes on today's webinar, and those will be emailed to you automatically at the end of the presentation. If you happen to be experiencing technical problems during the webinar, please click on the Request Support button on the lower left side of the player. And finally, a note on continuing education credit. You will receive an email after the webinar with instructions on how to get your proof of attendance. We're going to be asking you to check into these sessions through the CX Energy app to automate that process. Closing out the virtual experience today is ASHRAE 90.1, Commissioning Requirements, Changes, and comparison to the International Energy Efficiency Code, with your speaker, Reid Hart of Pacific Northwest National Labs. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And with that, I'll hand it off to you, Reid.
Thank you very much, Sam. Well, welcome, everyone. And I'm happy to have a chance to talk to you today a little bit about commissioning in 90.1 and how it's evolved with the last edition, with the 2019 edition. And we'll be talking about, why, of course, that's preaching to the choir, but why should we do commissioning or include that in our energy codes? Talk a little bit about the requirements that are in 90.1, and also I think there are some questions about what finally ended up in 90.1, so I'll address some of those bones of contention perhaps, and then also talk a little bit more about the comparison of 90.1, 189.1, and the IECC. And since we're offering AIA credits, we have learning objectives, and I think you can see those on the screen. So let me move on to why commissioning. Again, preaching to the choir here, but this is part of what I had to present. I was the chair of a commissioning working group, and I've been working with 90.1 for the last 3 cycles, or 3 editions. And also been involved in the IECC process as well for the last 3 cycles of their development. So basically, why commissioning? We have to show cost effectiveness in 90.1, and I was able to go back, fortunately, and look at some study that was done. We assume that all field assemblies and controls work when we calculate the energy savings in 90.1. We assume everything works perfectly, but of course, as commissioning agents, or involved in the commissioning industry, you know that that is not the case. We have established through some pretty broad range studies, if we go back to Evan Mills, that's the biggest collection of data in this area from 2011. Frankly, that's getting a little long in the tooth. It'd be great if someone did a little more modern study or expanded the data in that study. That's the one we've been relying on to prove that there is some benefit from commissioning. And fortunately, that study does include and separate both new and retrofit commissioning. And you can see on this graph what kind of payback time we get related to the energy use index of the buildings, with the circles here being larger when there's more savings. And this graph is interesting. It shows the number of deficiencies discovered in the buildings, and we can see that it's pretty high. This is based on 82 new buildings in 15 states. And well, we've got both new and retrofit buildings shown there. So the lighter bars are the new buildings. The median energy savings found in the new construction was 13%, and the commissioning cost was about 0.4% on average. So that gave us a median payback of 4.2 years. And, you know, that was based on 8.8 million square feet. So it's a pretty good study. And in the 43 new construction buildings, there were 3,500 deficiencies. So we can see that commissioning did point out several things that have to be there. That median payback of 4 years definitely qualifies as cost effective in ASHRAE. We use a modified discounted payback. It's called the scalar when we analyze whether things are cost effective. So I was able to show to the committee that commissioning did make sense. And then it was a question of what we did going forward. So I'm going to spend more time with this table when we get to the end. The big question, what is the difference between 2016 and 2019? And we'll be diving into that into a little more detail. I mean, basically, there were some functional performance testing requirements in 2016, but really commissioning was only required for mechanical in buildings greater than 50,000 square feet. Whereas we've moved, I'll get into the breakdown later, but we've moved that level down quite a bit as far as number of buildings that would be included, or at least square footage covered that would be included in commissioning. And we, in the process, followed 189, which led with putting commissioning into this advanced building guideline. And actually 2018 put in a little more clear commissioning requirements ahead of 90.1 2016. Now, one reason we felt commissioning was important for 90.1 is we did a survey back in 2016 as part of a code controls verification. We went out to 24 buildings and actually looked at 14 different 4 lighting measures and 10 HVAC measures, and saw how they complied with code as far as how they were installed. And related to that, we also did a survey of 10 commissioning provider firms across the country. And 2 of those results stand out. So granted, it's not a huge sample, only 10 firms, but only 4 of those, or 40%, said that energy code compliance verification was included in their commissioning scope. And only, again, 4 of them said, and actually they said sometimes, not yes, that the construction documents provided sufficient information for successful implementation of those energy code items. So those were the 2 important questions in that survey that led us to believe that it was important to get more clarity about commissioning energy code measures into 90.1. So again, in conclusion, we do have ASHRAE Standard 202, which defines the process for commissioning. However, at least my best understanding of Standard 202, is that it's still up to the owner to define the scope within the process. In other words, what actually gets commissioned. So 202 does not tell you what to do for specific areas for energy efficiency, for instance. And in fact, there's not a lot of guidelines there on actual, testing procedures to use in there. Guideline 0 and 1.1 and other guidelines do provide information on specific tests, but it does not tell you what to include in your scope. So, for instance, in 90.1, we're interested in energy efficiency. We have very specific items related to that, and so we wanted to define a list of what to do, so that we've got the process of 202, but we wanted to clearly define in 90.1, we want you to specifically commission these items. Now, commissioning, verification, and testing is now accepted. It's required in the base lead approach. It's required on federal project. It's found to be cost effective based on field studies in the past 2 decades. So, that was the basis of being able to convince the 90.1 Standards Committee to move ahead. So let's talk about 90.1 2019 testing and commissioning requirements. Well, first we should look at what existed in 2016 ahead of time. We did have some functional performance testing and verification documentation requirements. We had some envelope verification requirements. There was an optional envelope leakage testing that was an option to doing more detailed verification. There was separate in the disciplines how you documented the functional performance testing. There was lighting functional performance testing and HVAC functional performance testing, although frankly it was one sentence and a little bit vague. And then we did have an HVAC commissioning requirement for buildings over 50,000 square feet. Again, a couple of sentences, not a lot of detail about what we're looking for in those requirements. There was nothing required for some of our power system controls, plug load controls, that sort of thing. There was nothing related to surface hot water controls, and we've also got pressure pump systems in there for booster pumps that also have controls that did not have any requirements. So if we move into 2019, for verification, testing, and commissioning, we first of all put in place uniform documentation across mechanical, lighting, and surface water, heat, and power for functional performance documentation. So that would all have one format and come together in at least similar formats so that the building official could look at something that was somewhat consistent. We added power, surface hot water, and pressure pump functional performance testing, and we put more detail into what was required for the HVAC functional performance testing. The lighting envelope and optional, the actual testing required didn't change at all, but we did add over 10,000 square foot buildings, with a couple of exceptions, would have a commissioning layer added on with commissioning documentation, so that all of this functional performance testing would roll in under that commissioning oversight situation. Now, we did make warehouses exempt, even if they were larger than 10,000 square feet, and we also allowed simple HVAC systems, pretty much a programmable thermostat, to be exempt up to a 25,000 square foot building. Now, this is an eye chart situation, but it gets into some of the details. Again, what was required as far as functional testing and verification in 2016, and then over on the 2019 side, again, we added service water heating controls testing so that the temperature controls would be verified to be there and set up properly. Any heat trace or recirculation pump controls would be verified. There's also some pool time switch requirements. Those would be verified as well. Then in the power system, There are requirements for receptacle control in several building types, that those would be verified to be functioning properly, and that the end use monitoring systems would be checked out as well. Also in the other systems, we looked at water pressure booster systems requiring some commissioning check. There are some elevator light and fan standby mode controls that that now are listed as requiring testing, and where it's required, whole building energy monitoring would require testing. And then we've got our performance path. It's kind of fallen off the slide there, but Chapter 11 and Appendix G, we just put some general language in there that says, gee, if you did anything new and different that wasn't in the prescriptive control requirements, that if that was part of your basis of savings, then you would have to include that in your verification, testing, and commissioning requirements. So what does that look like? I mean, basically, to put it together, we've got verification and functional performance testing details. Those are included. Section 5 is envelope, 6 is mechanical, 7 is service hot water, 8 is our power systems, 9 is lighting, 10 is other systems, and then we've got our 2 performance sections. So those basic requirements say what needs to be tested, and then we again added a uniform up in the administrative section, uniform requirements about who are V&T providers, generally what qualifications, not a very detailed requirement set, I will admit, and that there be some functional performance testing provisions in the construction documents, and that there be a uniform basically structure for the verification and testing documentation. Then for the largest square footage of buildings, not necessarily most buildings, but buildings over the size that we'll talk about in a minute or review in a minute, we added that there be a commissioning plan, that there be a design review, there be commissioning reporting, and there is a provision, although it's kind of a blank area that hasn't been filled out, that if there are additional commissioning requirements beyond verification and testing, those can be included. There's a placeholder for those in the other discipline sections. So where is that layer of commissioning required? Basically, we started off with 10,000 square feet. That matches up with what 189.1 had adopted. And we did exempt warehouses, and we did say that buildings, simple buildings that had simple HVAC control systems under 25,000 square feet would not require that additional commissioning layer. They just had to do the verification performance testing. And then, that represents about 27% of the floor area, but 80% of the building. So 80% of the buildings, these smaller buildings, we get a lot of those, would not have a commissioning requirement. And with some of the more conservative parts of the committee, it was important that every little building not necessarily have that added cost of basically full commissioning process. Then it turns out that the floor area required for commissioning is going to be about 73%. If we add these two columns together, 50,000 is kind of a break point, even though it's 25, because 50,000 was our old level. So for mechanical commissioning, we've added 23% of the floor area. So it's not huge in the building count, only about 20% of the buildings. And they would all require, actually across the board, we require the verification performance testing. We do require a design review as part of commissioning, and that was based on some analysis done for Title 24 that proved that that was cost effective. And we do require construction phase commissioning be in place, and that a basically preliminary commissioning report be delivered and available for the building inspector if they want it. And then if we've, let's see, yeah. So that's the basic requirement. All right, so moving on, I think we're all familiar with commissioning. Now, what I do want to make clear is what is commissioning in 90.1 2019, and this was adopted under Addendum AI to 2016. So it specifically includes verification as well as testing, and it's the same as required for smaller or less complex buildings. So we bring all that together, and we also include verification that the building meets the standard 91, which is not necessarily included in a lot of commissioning scopes based on that survey we heard earlier. And from 90.1's point of view, that is an important aspect that we want covered. The commissioning plan and reporting is required in accordance with standard 202, although there is a provision a local jurisdiction could allow some other engineering standard of their choice. And we do want a distinct verification and commissioning disciplines in the later sections. So the updates, again, developed a consistent approach across the technical sections, tried to organize that in one place in each section that's uniform, so the commissioning agent developing their scope could find that information, coordinate the 90.1 commissioning requirements and format with standards 189 and 202, and include that design review when commissioning is required based on the Title 24 cost effectiveness. And we do include a review of 90.1 compliance. And so the documentation required, and we can touch on this a little more detail later, but basically we do want a commissioning plan. We want a commissioning design review report so that we catch any missing 90.1 efficiency items during the design. We don't wait and catch them out in the field. We do want verification and functional performance testing reports all assembled in the commissioning documentation and the preliminary commissioning report. And then even though it's past the occupancy permit, we have provision for a final commissioning report to be delivered to the owner. That does exist in the construction documents as a requirement. So again, 202 versus 90.1, 202 defines the process, and it requires that you identify what you're going to commission, verify, or perform testing on, but it doesn't specify what items should be included. So we felt it was up to the owner. Since it's up to the owner what to include in the plan, we wanted to go ahead in 90.1 and request specific verification and functional performance items, and that design review be included. So basically, if additional things beyond what 90.1 wants to call for their commissioning, and certainly they should, that's great, but 90.1 requirements specifically relate, 90.1 commissioning requirements specifically relate to what the 90.1 requirements are. Now we do have some provider definitions in there for what's a verification and testing provider and what's a commissioning provider. These definitions are frankly pretty general, and that's kind of what we've got in there. There is an informative appendix, Appendix H, that does provide some more information on what you might want as far as commissioning certification or verification and testing certification, as well as a good set of references. Now that, as an informative appendix, is not normative language. It doesn't require things. However, it does lead people toward the path. It also points out some additional things that you may want to commission that 90.1 doesn't require. For instance, moisture verification of the of the vapor barriers and that sort of thing in the envelope. While 90.1 doesn't necessarily require that. It's out of the scope of 90.1. It does suggest that it's a good idea to do that because obviously moisture penetration can compromise the insulation and could result in a reduction in effectiveness of your building insulation. So as far as provider requirements and independence, that's listed here. There is not a specific requirement in 90.1 that either the verification testing providers or the commissioning providers be third-party independent. However, there is a requirement that there at least be a firewall in the sense that they are not associated with either the design or construction of the building project. So they would have to be at least quasi-independent within the firm. Now, the one exception to that is in the envelope verification section, there is a requirement that that entity be a third-party independent. So that's the level of independence or the balance we struck probably as a compromise, although again, it does suggest in the informative appendix that there are benefits to having a third-party person or a certified commissioning agent. Now this table is taken from the informative appendix. Again, what we did our best to do in that informative appendix is walk through, here's the standard process that Standard 202 lays out and indicate where 90.1 specifically requires those things and point to the actual sections in 90.1 where those requirements are made. Now you notice, for instance, we don't require in 90.1 an OPR document or a basis of design document. From 90.1's point of view, 90.1 standard is that document as far as we are concerned. Now we do in the informative appendix say that there are probably great benefits to including those things in your commissioning process. However, it was not the sense that that was an appropriate call for 90.1 to make as far as requiring things. We do require a commissioning plan, that there be requirements in the control documentation, or I'm sorry, the construction documents for contractor interaction with commissioning work, that there be a design review. Submittal review report suggested in 202 is not specifically required in 90.1. We do require that functional performance testing happen and that issues get tracked in the commissioning report. And if things are not in compliance, that they be reported in that preliminary commissioning report and then in the final report. Systems manual, there are some requirements for systems manual, but not a specific requirement for the commissioning provider to review those in 90.1, nor training and training reports. We definitely require a preliminary commissioning report, and there aren't additional updates required as 202 lists out, and there's a final commissioning report required. However, that is typically after the occupancy permit, so frankly, there's not a lot of teeth in that requirement. Okay, also in the informative appendix, again, some of the language is fairly general, and the language in the actual requirements, for instance, HVAC just says commission all control or verify and test proper operation of all controls. It doesn't get into a blow by blow. However, in the informative appendix, we do have a 3-page table that lists everything in all of the discipline sections that we felt would be appropriate to provide some commissioning for. What section is it in? What's the topic of that requirement in the report? And then what type of things should be verified in there. Again, this is informative language. It's not mandatory, but it certainly would be a good tool for a commissioning provider to use in developing their scope in working with an owner. So that is again available in our informative appendix. Okay, I've covered the requirements that now exist in 90.1 2019, and let me just touch on our fine ANSI consensus process. It doesn't mean everyone at each extreme is happy, all the way from some of the developer entities who don't feel we should require commissioning at all. That should be up to them, to maybe the commissioning industries that felt we should have gone a little further with what we did. You know, there are a few potential bones of contention, I would say, with the commissioning industry, and we did have a representative from 202 as well as 189 on our commissioning working group in 90.1. So we did reach out to the industry and bring in some feedback. And again, as you're all aware, in the ANSI process, we do our best to arrive at least a 2/3 vote in favor of things, and then also respond very carefully to public review as things move along. So potential bones of contention, we do require that 90.1 compliance be documented in the commissioning process, and the commissioning authority is not fully independent. We acknowledge that in our requirements. We do put a limit on buildings to have full commissioning, and we do have a limit on the commissioning scope required for 90.1. In other words, we don't dictate to the owner what they put in commissioning, but we say, if you're complying with 90.1, these are the things you shall have in there to make sure that 90.1 items get verified. And again, we go back to this survey we did, where why are we requiring that the commissioning provider actually look at the provisions? And so there is, you know, again, only 4 out of 10 commissioning providers we surveyed were including anything in their scope in general related to verifying the energy efficiency provisions in 90.1. And then we also saw that even the designers in their plans and specs were not being very careful to detail what was going on. Only 40% saw that some of the time it was compliant, and as far as commissioning agent review of those construction documents, and you know, 6 of the provider firms said, nah, they just never really include them. So we are requiring that some level of commissioning include the verification of 90.1. Now, you know, you can certainly write your scope however you write it, as far as you aren't actually, you know, verifying full code compliance. We use the word insufficient detail. In other words, you know, and a good effort is made to verify that this drawing, this set of construction documents does meet 90.1, and we think those words insufficient detail were added to indicate in our requirements that, hey, you don't have to totally verify every tiny detail, but we do want a general verification that 90.1 requirements are being met. And then as far as commissioning independence, we go to this middle ground place of having the individual who's doing either functional testing or commissioning, that they could be associated with the firm, the design firm or contractor, but not directly associated with the design or installation of the building systems controlled or envelope being commissioned. So again, you have to have that internal firewall with the individuals who are doing that work. Although again, envelope verification does require a third-party provider. And then as far as limits on buildings with commissioning, so we don't require it in every building. We do require cost effectiveness. We matched up with this 10,000 square foot limit that 189.1 requires. Now 90.1 is the minimum standard, so there's an implied lesser requirement than the more advanced code 189.1 standard that's incorporated in the IGCC. We also excluded warehouses. It just felt that those systems were simple enough that as long as they did the testing to verify things were working, the lighting controls and simple HVAC controls, that they did not need that added layer of full commissioning process, and also simple HVAC systems in buildings smaller than 25,000 square feet. So all commissioning does include design phase commissioning. There was some discussion about, well, should we cut that off at 50,000 square feet? No, it's cut off at the 10,000 square feet or 25,000 for simple systems. So there is a design review required in 90.1, and we do require verification or functional performance testing. And again, we've reviewed this earlier where the commissioning is required. So again, we wanted to apply the Pareto principle. We want to capture, the more complex buildings where commissioning is of a benefit. One other thing I didn't mention is many, at least in the mechanical section and getting more so in the lighting section, the controls are getting to be more important as far as where we expect the energy savings to come from. Unfortunately, most building officials, there are a few exceptions, but most are not really in depth with the controls. And we felt it was very important that for the more complex buildings that we do have a commissioning agent who's typically going in and doing trend logs and that sort of thing, looking at the controls and coming back and giving the building official that assurance that, indeed, the controls in this building are actually implemented. We've added language in 90.1 that not only shall the controls be capable of doing what they're supposed to do, but they actually are supposed to be configured to do those set points and those requirements at the time of inspection. So before the occupancy permit, the actual controls should be set up and be put in place. Okay, moving on. So there are some limits on the commissioning scope. Again, the scope of 90.1 is energy efficiency requirements. So we can't put in place commissioning requirements in 90.1 that go above and beyond the energy efficiency requirements of 90.1. There are certainly other things, comfort, safety, performance, maybe even moisture penetration. I used that example earlier. A lot of those things may well help the ongoing persistence of the energy conservation items in 90.1. However, they are pretty much beyond the scope of 90.1. So 90.1 is consistent with Standard 202, but it does not include everything. And we do have an interest in verification, performance testing, or commissioning of, again, the energy efficient items. And that's what we've included. As I mentioned earlier, we don't explicitly call for OPR or basis of design. That is suggested to be beneficial in that informative appendix, but that is up to the commissioning provider and the owner to agree to in their scope. We do call for documentation that the building systems are installed and they meet 90.1. So there is that. Let me just do a final comparison then, and we'll get to some of your questions, of a comparison of commissioning in 90.1 and 189.1 in the IECC. So let's take a look at that back to this table. Now, there are a lot of asterisks in the table. So what it amounts to is in 90.1 2016, commissioning was required only for mechanical systems based on the building size, and that was it, although basic functional testing was required for the HVAC controls. And there was this 5,000 square foot minimum size where a commissioning requirement came into play. And again, that was only for mechanical. Now, there did exist functional performance testing for lighting systems and controls. One interesting thing is that there was no standard document out there for a functional performance testing method for lighting controls. Now, there are plenty of suggested functional performance tests out there in the commissioning industry, and we refer to a lot of those in our informative appendix. I think we refer to about a half a dozen different sources people can get functional performance tests from. However, one thing we would like to see the industry do is move forward in developing an ANSI consensus standard through some mechanism reform, possibly through ASHRAE, maybe through somewhere else, or ASHRAE IES, that becomes a standard document. And if that comes into play, then we could then reference that from 90.1. But at this point, some of the less formal documents we're unable to reference since they don't meet the ANSI standard criteria. So again, we suggest those in the informative appendix, and we think we've got a pretty good list there. But we can't. It would have been nice to be able to say in the lighting section reference an IES document. Again, it's a guideline in IES, not a standard, so we don't reference that process. If we move into 2019, so again, the verification testing is required for all systems. We've expanded the systems so that now everything is covered, at least everything with any controls or complexity, so that we've got that covered now. And then the commissioning, once we get above 10,000 square foot for a building, we do have to do verification and testing for the systems. There's certain required functional testing required, and that rolls under the umbrella of commissioning for the larger, more complex buildings. In 189.1, their cutoffs are a little bit different. They actually don't require functional performance testing in all buildings. They have some lower limits as far as system size that 90.1 doesn't have. We say, hey, you're supposed to check it. Even a programmable thermostat, someone should take a look and make sure that's set up correctly, even in a small building. So there's some minimum system sizes as far as hot water load, airflow, and heating load capacity that happen in 189.1. And then as far as commissioning, they require it basically once you get over that 10,000 square foot limit and you've already got these requirements on the performance testing. 2018 IECC, which is the code adopted by many states, and ASHRAE does try and make an effort to go over to the hearings in IECC and get things adopted that come up in 90.1. So there's pretty good correlation between the two sets of energy efficiency codes. 2018 IECC also has these requirements that are based on cooling capacity, heating capacity. Here they combine the mechanical and surface water heating. And if you're over one of those, either cooling or heating limits, then you're required to do it. So you could have a building with no cooling whatsoever, but if your heating load is big enough, then you would have to do it. And frankly, IECC, I would say, came ahead of both 189 and 90.1 as far as putting in a somewhat detailed requirement for commissioning documentation requirements. Although the commissioning in IECC is pretty much limited to the mechanical and surface water heat systems. Lighting, there's the same functional performance test in 90.1 for lighting controls, but it's not rolled under the commissioning envelope as it is in 90.1. So that's a difference we see there. So again, I think I've covered most of this. We are referencing Standard 202 as a guideline. We do require a commissioning plan. IECC does, again, only for mechanical. We require a design review that's included in IECC, a preliminary report delivered before the occupancy permit, and then a final report that is delivered to the owner later. That's required, but again, not much teeth once the occupancy permit is issued. We've got different limits on when it's required. There's an envelope commissioning, either verification or test option in 90.1. In IECC, actually just adopted for the 2021 IECC, there's now actually envelope testing required at a certain building size by climate zone, but there's not necessarily commissioning. There's also a requirement for verification now in 2021. There was nothing for envelope before in the IECC in 2018. And again, lighting is functional performance testing with no commissioning report. And now I think we'll go back to Sam, who's organized all of your questions, and we'll do our best to answer them.
Thank you, Reid. We received many questions, so we'll get to as many as we can. Right now, I have 12 lined up for you at the moment, and we have more coming in. The first one is, can you please clarify the cross-discipline consistent requirements, which says that verification and testing providers are not required to be involved in design or construction. Can you clarify what this actually means? They have to be separate entity or firm?
Yeah, so they have to be a separate employee. So in other words, or person. So in other words, a lighting contractor could have an employee in their firm do the functional testing for lighting. However, that individual could not have been involved in either the design or construction of those lighting controls. So that's probably a good example. And that's true of commissioning as well. The engineering firm who designed the building could provide the commissioning. However, there would have to be an internal firewall where those individuals were not involved in either the design or construction process inspections and that sort of thing. It would have to be a separate individual.
Okay, next question. In 5.9.2.2, how many pressure tests are required and what other requirements are needed for the blower tests?
I believe 5.9 refers out to a separate standard for the testing. I could look at that quickly. And I don't believe it gets into a lot of detail as far as what is required. And actually the air leakage is in 5.4.3 and 90.1. It does refer to ASTM E779 and ASTM E1827. So I believe those standards would indicate how you're going to proceed. The 90.1 just sets a target of 0.4 CFM per square foot of the building envelope at a pressure differential of 0.3 inches water gauge.
Okay, the next question is, as part of the requirements for confirming that buildings comply with 90.1, will CXAs be required to review and accept and/or reject energy models for designs that are not following the prescriptive path?
The only commissioning requirements added related to the performance path is that if you do something there, let's say you have some innovative new storage system or something that's not covered in the design, you would have to provide reasonable commissioning testing of that technology or controls to verify that it worked as part of your commissioning process. Again, if your building is of the size that commissioning is required. I hope that answers that question. The actual modeling, and let me just back up, the actual modeling and that with the performance path, there's a whole separate process to develop requirements or basically tools that would help the building official determine whether the performance modeling was correct and whether what was in the construction documents and installed was correct. So maybe getting back to the commissioning process related to modeling, I believe, once there's been an outline of what was being modeled, there should be a connection between that and what is actually installed in the building. And I think we would look at the commissioning agent or commissioning provider to look at that correlation and make sure if they modeled some type of something different from the prescriptive path, that actually shows up in the building. Go ahead.
Are there specific tests identified for building envelope? And this person put in air barrier as an example.
Yeah, I think that gets back to the earlier indication that there are ASTM requirements, standards for how you do the testing, and we rely on those. We refer to those in 5.4311.
Okay, the next question is, can the verification and testing provider be the general contractor?
Again, they could be an employee of the general contractor, but they should be independent from the installation construction process.
Okay. So for envelope commissioning, if a firm is on a project and we have a building envelope commissioning in-house, we can't commission an envelope and need to be a third party, but the MEP commissioning can occur. How was one justification reached over the other?
Yeah, any commissioning and testing requirements before this effort were pretty much independently set up by the subcommittees in 90.1, and when the envelope subcommittee set up that requirement, they specifically called for a third-party independent inspector. The other subcommittees have not crossed that line, and that might be something that comes in down the road. Again, to get a general requirement, we wanted at least that minimum level of internal independence. And again, down the road, there may be movements to more independence. Now, in the informative appendix, there is a suggestion that yes, it is beneficial to have a third party involved. However, that's obviously a choice of the owner when they develop their scope.
What is the difference between preliminary commissioning report and final commissioning report? When is the preliminary commissioning report required to be submitted?
The preliminary report does have to be in place before the occupancy permit. So it's part of the that final approval process. And it also has to outline what things could not be tested or are still outstanding that need to be addressed in the final commissioning report.
Okay, there's a follow-up to the one that was previously answered. Modeling is sometimes used to show 90.1 compliance. Does the CXA need to review the model?
That's an interesting question. I think the CSA needs to review something related to the model as part of the modeling process, as part of the performance path. And again, this is an area where there are tools being developed and probably an increase in requirements. Someone should create a document that says, well, here's what was modeled. So I think they don't necessarily have to review the modeling for the modeling accuracy, but they need to have a list out of the modeling process. These are the things that will be installed in the building, and make sure the construction documents contain those things. That becomes their set of requirements to meet 90.1. So it's kind of an intermediate solution, but yes, they should review what any variances from the prescriptive path that are required should be included in what they look at.
Okay, the next question is there guidance on the necessary frequency of on-site presence for installation, observation, and inspection during construction? This assumption can cause significant variation in pricing.
At this point, again, the requirements are fairly general. We don't, go down to a level of detail. I think probably the lighting functional testing is the most detailed, where it actually calls out how many occupancy sensors you have to test and that sort of thing. So I think the requirements here leave it up to the owner and the commissioning authority to come up with their approach. Maybe it's a statistical approach. They're going to test every VAV box. Maybe they're going to test 10%. Whatever process they're going to engage in. However, we do want testing to proceed in some reasonable fashion.
Okay, this next person is asking if you can elaborate further on when you said OPR/BOD not required. From our viewpoint, 90.1 covers that.
Yeah, it's 189.1 actually did require the owner's document. We didn't specifically require that. We do recommend it in the informative appendix. And I guess at the end of the day, the requirements of 90.1 are what we want to see. Now, often in the basis of design, that ends up just a single line, and even in some construction documents saying things shall comply with 90.1. Now, that's not very detailed and probably not likely to produce the result we want. But 90.1 is a standard document, and these are the things that are required. And we do want those things to be verified. Again, in the informative appendix, we recommend those other documents as part of the commissioning process. And at the end of the day, in a minimal project where someone wants to do minimal commissioning, they may not want to go through that effort, but we do want them to at least verify that it meets 90.1. Now, one thing I didn't mention is the 90.1 user's manual does provide checklists that a commissioning authority could use of here are the things that should be in place for compliance with 90.1. So that certainly seems to be a reasonable way to go.
Okay. Is there a requirement or informative appendix recommendation on who the commissioning agent should work for, the owner, the contractor, or the design team?
I can't remember exactly what we said about that. In the informative appendix, we did not say anything about it in the requirements. In fact, we say the commissioning agent could be owner's employees, and there are some large organizations that may have qualified people on staff. We do have just a general statement of qualification in the definition of the commissioning agent, but I do not remember exactly what we said. I mean, we do have some statements about qualifications and independence in the informative appendix that are much more clear or suggestive than what's in the actual requirements. So.
Okay, moving along. With the need for verification and testing providers being under the commissioning provider, is ASHRAE 90.1 commissioning implying that the installation contractors are not responsible for showing that their installed systems function as shown on contract documents, as this would be the verification and testing portion?
So I think there's some room to work with that there. The requirement is that the functional performance testing results be included in the commissioning and reviewed by the commissioning authority. But that doesn't mean that the functional performance testing couldn't be conducted by an individual who's quasi-independent in the contractor and then have that submitted to the commissioning authority. So, you know, those are somewhat two separate things. So the functional testing could be performed in-house by the commissioning authority. It could be performed by an outside entity, but it does need to at least come under the umbrella of the commissioning and be included in the commissioning report that, yes, the commissioning authority looked at it at least and included it there. At least that's my understanding of how that would work.
Are hospitals, OSHPD, for example, exempt from any of ASHRAE's 90.1 commissioning requirements?
If a hospital was under a jurisdiction that required 90.1, then just like all the other 90.1 requirements, they would have to comply. There certainly are exceptions in some of the 90.1 requirements related to, say, specific ventilation or air change requirements under Standard 170 for health situations, but the commissioning requirements, I believe, would apply to a hospital, yes.
Energy codes are adopted by individual states. For example, in Ohio, they're still using 90.1 2010 as the energy code. Do you know what energy codes federal projects must comply with? Do you know of any entities that required 90.1 2019 at this point?
Good question. So if you go to the website, if you Google BECP, stands for Building Energy Codes Program, and adoption, those two words will take you to a page that shows you a map of the country and what level of codes related to 90.1 they've adopted. And it's not always exactly equal. There's individual state amendments. They might adopt ICC that's quasi-equivalent to a certain level of 90.1. There are still people using 90.1 2004 or equivalent. And in fact, there are multiple states that have absolutely no energy code requirements. Right now, there are a few progressive states that, even if they're using the ICC, they have incorporated many of the more important provisions from 90.1 2019, or they have adopted based on 2019. As far as federal projects, in theory, federal projects can do whatever they want. However, there is some legislation in place that says they basically follow the latest version of 90.1. So that is in place, and I don't work with the feds on that project. One of my cohorts does, but that's my understanding, that there is a requirement that federal construction meet 90.1, the latest version, and there may be a little lag time in there. I know the state of New York has adopted most of, or even further than 90.1 2019. I would have to look at the map to see if a couple other states had moved that far ahead, although the map may be 6 months out of date. So.
Okay, there are about 4 more questions to run through. The next one is, what power systems are required to be tested under 90.1 2019? Does that include power distribution and emergency power?
The answer to those 2 items is no. The specific call out of requirements is for, there is a requirement for plug load control, whether an occupancy sensor or time clock type control, so that things don't get left on in unoccupied spaces, and half the outlets in certain building types or space types have to be controlled that way. That's one item. Also, in the power section of 90.1 are requirements for end-use monitoring that may be integrated into the distribution system. You have some systems where every circuit breaker also becomes a monitoring device, and there is a requirement that system be tested or reviewed at some level as part of the functional testing or performance scope or commissioning scope.
Can you distinguish between commissioning and FPT core requirements? For example, lighting, FPT, and this person put in parentheses, commissioning if over 10,000 square feet.
Right, well, I think the distinguishing difference is that there's a little bit more documentation. Like for instance, there's got to be a commissioning plan. And so the commissioning plan may identify in a little more detail what functional performance testing is required. Now there's 3 specific areas: occupancy sensors, daylighting controls, and some of the time clock controls that are required, have specific named functional testing. If a commissioning plan comes in place working with the owner on the scope, maybe there's a more advanced lighting control system that we don't have specific requirements for, that might then have additional functional testing under the commissioning plan. Probably commissioning also, again, provides a more unified documentation, a more unified issues log approach, and that sort of thing, and brings it all together in one place. So that's the way I see the overlay of commissioning, integrated with possibly multiple efforts in functional performance testing.
Okay, for this next person, they're asking for your thoughts on, as you being part of multiple committees where there's an objection to having a CXA as a true independent entity and not just a person from the design team or contractor who is not part of that project, they always feel that this defeats the purpose of an actual third party.
let's see, I'm not quite getting the question. So the fact that 90.1 allows this quasi-independence rather than full third-party independence, again, that could be a bone of contention. Maybe down the road that will change. I think to make that move in 90.1, we would need to see some sort of a field study that tells us, oh, when we have an independent third party versus this quasi-independence, lo and behold, we have a higher discovery rate of non-compliant controls, or we do a better job, or that sort of thing. So anyway, I think maybe that answers that.
Okay, thank you. Last question we have up here is, doesn't the obligation of code compliance reside with the architect and or engineer and the AHJ? Does code review involve the CXA in a component of design requirements unnecessarily?
Yeah, I know, again, that's one of those bones of contention. And I think not. I think absolutely it is the designer's job to make sure they comply with the code. What we're asking for is an independent review at the design level to feed back to the designer, just as you'd feedback in an issue log to the contractor. Hey, here are some items that clearly don't meet the basic energy efficiency code. I know I was involved in running a utility new construction program for quite some time, and we always found things in the design that not only were not going above code to get an incentive, but actually didn't meet the minimum code requirements. And usually if that's done during the design, it goes back. Now that's a question of how you write your contract. Again, we're just looking for a review and verification in sufficient detail to indicate that this building, meets 90.1.
Reid, I'm going to slip in one last question here. Is envelope commissioning optional for all buildings?
So in IECC, well, actually, okay. So let's stick to our standards. In 90.1, there is a requirement that you either go down a testing path and test, or you go down what I would call a envelope verification path with a third-party independent verifier. So you have to do one of those two things. And if you do the verification, they didn't specifically call it commissioning. However, in a building that meets the commissioning requirements, that verification process would roll under the overall commissioning umbrella. In IECC, there used to be no requirements for envelope verification or commissioning. Envelope is still not listed in the separate chapter on commissioning that IECC has. However, not in the current 2018, but in the 2021 IECC, and that's still working through the staff final adoption and working process. In fact, I was working with IECC staff yesterday on the language for that. There is now a requirement for testing of buildings of a certain size. So it's a flat requirement. You've got to do the testing once you hit a certain size. And multifamily, that's for tall buildings under IECC, also fall under that. There's some sampling allowed there. And then there's also a requirement that for those buildings that are not tested, then there's a verification requirement written up. Now, again, it's written as a verification. It's not written as specifically commissioning, but certainly when commissioning required, that would roll under.
Okay, and that was the last question. Thank you so much, Reid.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to present this today.
I want to note that everyone participating should keep an eye out for an email regarding information on your learning units from the CX Energy app. While you're in the app today, I also ask that everyone please take a moment to evaluate this presentation. I want to close things out by thanking the presenter once again and everyone who joined us, including our members across all three organizations. This was our first non-in-person CX Energy, and despite the current pandemic, we're glad and very happy we're able to virtually connect with everyone.